大家好，欢迎来我的频道. How are you guys doing? Did you learn your pinyin pretty well by now? And if not, check out last week's video where I talked about how to learn pinyin, because today we're going to take a deep dive into the wonderful world of Chinese characters. And if you've never seen Chinese characters before, which would be fairly shocking with the popularity of bubble tea shops across American cities, among other pop cultural references, they look like this, and you have two variations depending on which region of the world you're in. Traditional characters, which is what calligraphy fonts are usually written in, are used in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau, and many of our local Chinatowns often use traditional characters. Cantonese also uses traditional characters, but pronunciations and meanings are very, very, very different from Mandarin, so be aware of that. Simplified characters are used in mainland China, Singapore, and Malaysia. And simplified characters were actually introduced to improve the literacy rate back in China in the 1950s by simplifying traditional characters to use less strokes or by merging various characters together. And what that ultimately means, though, is that there are some characters where the simplified version is so much easier to learn than the traditional character, and it makes sense why it was simplified in that manner. But for others, the simplification doesn't really make too much sense. Remember the character that we learned last week? Mao, or cat. Let's examine the traditional and the simplified versions. The traditional has a little hat thing on the left part of the character, while the simplified version takes that general structure and uses the most essential identifying features of that part. The simplification makes sense, and you can tell that it's much easier to read, to write, and for some people to remember. But then take a look at this one. Ge. These are two completely different characters. Now in the traditional, I don't really see a line with a little carrot on top. I just kind of see a box with some shapes and then like a little thing on the left side. And this is just to say that simplified and traditional characters can be very similar or very different. So my suggestion would be to pick one and start learning that system first. If you want to learn both character variations, learn the second one after you've had a good grasp on the first system, or else it can be very confusing. So how do I choose a character system? Well, see which one you like the best, or choose based on the location each is used in. Do you want to go to Taiwan in the future? Learn traditional. Or is studying abroad in Shanghai part of your future plans? Learn simplified. So great, we've chosen a writing system. What's next? Well, let's look at how these characters are made. When you look up a character in a dictionary, you'll find three pieces of information. 1, the character. What does it look like? 2, the pinyin. How is it pronounced? And 3, the English definition. Now, that's a lot of information to learn for a single word. So give yourself time to learn characters. And even to this day, I still confuse the pinyin and the tones. I mistake one character for another, and that's okay. Learning is a process of increasing refinement. You learn, forget, relearn, forget, relearn, make mistakes, relearn. So give yourself time to learn and the grace to not stress out about the little mistakes. We went over the pinyin last week, and English is pretty explanatory, so we'll focus on number 1 today. What does the character look like? Some characters visually explain the meaning. So ko looks like an opening or a mouth. So oftentimes its meaning is related to the opening or the mouth of something, whether that be a person or an object. Man looks like a doorway, which is really helpful for its meaning of a door or opening or entrance. Now, if you look up the character man in the dictionary, and I personally recommend Pleco for all of my mobile dictionary needs, you'll notice that there is a ton of other definitions besides doorway with man. And this is another important thing to know about characters. Characters combine with other characters which modify their individual meanings, both literally and figuratively. 校门, 校 comes from 学校, which means school. So school plus door equals school gate. Or 店门 Tian is electricity, or something that uses electricity. So electricity plus opening equals a power switch. Open the electricity. Now there are other types of characters that don't necessarily relate to what they look like. How do we learn those ones? And this is where the concept of radicals and components usually come into play. Now, tons of blog posts and books can argue for one over the other. Integrated Chinese textbooks stress radicals, while the HSK doesn't even really bring it up. But ultimately, both systems try to break down characters into parts that make it easier to recognize and remember. Radicals are smaller pieces of the characters that you use to find a character in a dictionary. It doesn't include all of the pieces that a character can be composed of, but rather a select few that seem to be the most useful when they were generated. They're used to characterize a character visually, hence the dictionary use. But it doesn't tell you much information about the meaning or the pronunciation, and also characters are typically defined by one radical, whereas they may have multiple components. Character components, on the other hand, can characterize a character visually, like radicals, but they can also indicate a character's phonetic pronunciation or meaning. And as you can see, this ends up being a really powerful tool to help with word memorization and retention. So this is actually what I personally use when I learn new characters. And radicals do have some sort of meaning component as well to them, but it's not as ingrained into the character like components are, at least from my research on it. If you have a different opinion, let me know in the comments below. But since characters are composed from these different pieces of oftentimes multiple components, over time you'll notice that they'll actually have patterns. And I can even guess what a word probably sounds like or means just based on these different components. So some components hit at the pronunciation, while other components hint at the meaning. And other components in a character don't really seem to influence either. So ultimately, both radicals and components are tools, just tools to help us recognize the patterns that are inherent in the character composition. Our brains are pattern recognition masters, so the first step to learn characters is to notice the patterns. In the beginning, it may be difficult, but over time, you'll notice that patterns just seem to pop out at you. Once you recognize the meaning or pronunciation that component is hinting at, you learn to apply that to any new character that you see. But how do we do this? Let's look at this character to highlight a meaning component. Yo, or stream of water. The two dots and the little one slash thing on the left side are found in many characters that actually involve some form of fluid-like behavior, whether figuratively or literally. Hai is a sea or an ocean, he is a river, si is to wash, to rinse, to cleanse, to purify. Piao is to float and drift and fall through, both in a literal and figurative flowing type of motion. And note it's also in pialiang, or pretty, remarkable, and brilliant. You have schools of thought or a flow of ideas, or you can arouse or excite, which is a flow of emotions. This component is found in many characters and it can give you a hint, but it's not always going to fit perfectly because languages are not math. So knowing it could help you remember words where the pattern does fit, but it won't help out for words like this. May from like mayo, not, have not, or fa, law, rule, regulation. You could force it by saying it's a flowing of rules. You have the govern, to regulate and administer. You could also force that, like the previous character. You also have perform or continent and island. And maybe the traditional characters have a hint as to why this component is used in these latter sets of words, but I'm learning simplified, so I wouldn't really know that. So let me know in the comments if there's a pattern with these guys as well. As an example of a pronunciation component, let's take a look at this character, Feng. All of these characters are pronounced with Feng, just with different tones. You have Feng, 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 Feng. They all kind of look the same. They have the same character component, but they have other things mixed in together. And this also shows why Learning how to read the characters and not just relying on pinyin is super important because we have 3 second tones, 3 third tones, and 2 first tones just from a simple search on Pleco. But again, this doesn't always fit. Languages aren't math. So you may see this component and it won't give you an indication of the pronunciation. For example, sooo or yo. There is that fluid-like component thing we mentioned earlier too. And that actually gives you the hint of the meaning. To swim, to float, to drift and wander or roam, all of these fluid-like behaviors. But the fang in there doesn't really give you a hint on the pronunciation. Then we have shi and pang and li. So you can see how useful components can be to help with the word retention, but it will not perfectly fit to each character. But regardless of that fact, I still think it's incredibly useful to help you memorize. And I would not recommend memorizing all 200 possible components or all of the radicals. That's not a really fun time. But instead, when you learn a new character, pay very close attention to the components that it's comprised of. Have you seen it before? If so, what do those words sound like, or what is their meaning? Can you make any connections between them? And ultimately, that exercise will help you strengthen the word that you already knew, and this new word in tandem. It also will help you to apply that knowledge to future characters. So how do we learn Chinese characters? Well, for me, this has been the most helpful framework. 1, look at the character, the pinyin, and the English definition. 2, do you recognize any components? 3, is it a phonetic or a meaning hint? 4, relate it back to other words that you've learned that have a similar component. And 5, find the patterns. So now that we've tackled the character bit, how do we retain those characters? And tune in next week for my tips and tricks to learn and memorize Chinese characters. But if you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. It really helps me out in the algorithm. Check out Mandarin Companion. I really love them, and I hope that you will love them too. Got a discount in the description box. And check out my Patreon if you are interested in that. I'll be posting more Anki decks on the books that I'll be reading. I'll give an update on my book haul soon. Still waiting for some books to come in. And my reading book club I'm trying to figure out the details, so stay tuned for an official book club. But if you enjoyed this video, I will see you next week. Have a good one. 再见.